So I encourage you to go and watch the video on Stolnaker again. But here I'm just going to pull out some of the main ideas that it's going to be important to have at the top of your mind for what's going to come next. When we talked about Stolnaker's theory of assertion, we saw that there were two principles that he subscribed to. Hawthorne and Magador call one of them default, and what default says is that unless the principles of rational communication would be violated, the proposition that you assert by saying a sentence is just what the sentence means. So usually, when you assert something, you're just asserting what the sentence you're saying literally means. But the proviso is there because we saw that there are cases where that doesn't happen. The cases where that doesn't happen are the cases where what's called the uniformity principle are violated. Uniformity says that when we're communicating rationally, it's common ground what proposition is being asserted. This is Hawthorne and Magador's way of putting the idea that we saw from a few weeks ago that the proposition expressed by your sentence should be the same in all worlds in the context set. Or it should be common ground what proposition your sentence expresses. And the reason why we wanted uniformity, we wanted it to be common ground, we wanted people in general to assert propositions where it's common ground what the sentence expresses, was the idea that, well, if it's not common ground, then they won't know what proposition to add to the context set. So asserting is a proposal to add a proposition to the common ground. If the sentence you say expresses different propositions in the different worlds in the context set, then in some sense that means you don't know what proposition it expresses. So how could you add the proposition it expresses to the common ground if you don't know what proposition that is? That was the reason for wanting uniformity. But of course the other thing we saw was that sometimes uniformity really is violated, and yet we seem to be able to communicate perfectly naturally. There was the case where you're talking to you're talking to some unidentified person and you say something like, "You are hungry." We saw there's no problem in saying things like that. And in particular, there's no problem in saying things like that, even though clearly uniformity is violated there. It's not if you don't know who you're talking to, it's not the case that you know what proposition your sentence expresses in a situation like that. And we saw that Stolnaker has a solution for what goes on in such cases. He says that in cases like that, in cases where you violate uniformity, you assert the diagonal proposition. Now, I'm not going to go into all the gory details of what the diagonal is, but we saw that you can roughly think of the diagonal as saying, the proposition expressed by my utterance is true. That claim is itself the diagonal proposition corresponding to a particular utterance. It's worth emphasizing one more time the role that the diagonal was supposed to play here. So remember, the idea was that in cases where it's not obvious what the sentence means, we want to find something to update with. Because if I don't know what proposition that expresses, how am I going to add that to the common ground? We need to find something else to add to the common ground. And Stolnaker's idea was, well, even if we don't know what proposition is expressed by a particular sentence, so long as we know what the common ground is, we're always going to be able to find the diagonal corresponding to that sentence. And then we can just add the diagonal to the common ground. But notice what I said just there, the way I explained it is, I said, so long as we know what the common ground is, we can find the diagonal and then know that we can add that to the common ground instead. But of course, as we saw just a moment ago, giving up these principles like KK and PP exactly puts into question whether we can take for granted whether we know what the common ground is. And this is ultimately where the problem that Hawthorne and Magador raise is going to come from. So we've already seen that ignorance can have two different kinds of impacts on the theory of assertion. One kind of ignorance we talked about was ignorance about what proposition a sentence expresses. And we said that on Stolnaker's theory, that's supposed to motivate using the diagonal proposition instead of the one the sentence actually expresses. We've also just seen that depending on what we say about these KK or PP principles, another dimension of ignorance can enter the picture, because we might be ignorant about what the common ground is, or it might not be common ground what the common ground is. Now a natural question to ask is, what happens when these two kinds of ignorance are combined? What happens when you have cases that involve both ignorance about what proposition a sentence expresses, and ignorance about what exactly is in the common ground. And on the way that I'm going to present it, which is a little bit different from the way that Hawthorne and Magador present it, but I think it gets at the essence of what they're doing. What happens is that there's actually a conflict between the tool of diagonalization and the motivation for introducing it in the first place. So we saw that the motivation for introducing diagonalization was to remove ignorance about what proposition we're supposed to update with. What we'll see in a second is that when you combine these two different kinds of ignorance and you have diagonalization, there again arises a question and a problem about what proposition do you update on. So let's imagine a concrete case that has the two features that I said before. So I say the sentence, "They're a fool," and let's suppose that it's actually common ground that I'm talking about Alice. But let's suppose it's a case where it's not part of the common ground what the common ground is. We don't know what's in the common ground. And we think that it might be that the common ground leaves open that I was talking about somebody else. It could have been that the common ground didn't settle whether I was talking about Alice or Bob, although maybe it settles that I was talking about one of them. So in this situation, it's common ground that I'm talking about Alice, but it's not common ground that it's common ground that I'm talking about Alice, because the common ground leaves open that it might have been common ground that I was talking about either Alice or Bob. Now, crucially, we can also see that it is not, we don't know whether it's common ground what my sentence expresses. Because we don't exactly know what the common ground is. So there are two possibilities. One possibility is that the common ground is the one that settles that I'm talking about Alice. In that common ground, my sentence expresses the same thing in all worlds. It's settled that I'm talking about Alice. But there's this also other possibility for what the common ground might be. It could be that the common ground doesn't settle whether I'm talking about Alice or Bob. In that case, my sentence would express different things in the different worlds in the common ground. So in one of the possibilities, it's common ground what my sentence expresses. In the other possibility, it's not common ground what my sentence expresses. In the second one, in some worlds, my sentence expresses the proposition that Alice is a fool, but there are also worlds where it expresses the proposition that Bob is a fool. So we don't know whether it's common ground what proposition my sentence expresses. And the issue now is that it looks like we are now faced with exactly the kind of problem that diagonalization was supposed to solve. Remember, you said that the motivation for introducing diagonalization was that there are cases where we're ignorant of exactly what a sentence says, and so we assume the speaker is asserting the diagonal as a kind of backup. But if you think about this kind of situation, you'll see that we can actually get into a frame of mind where it seems like it's not clear what we should update with here. It's not clear what we should be taking the speaker to be proposing to add to the common ground. Because you could reason about the situation like this. You could say, well, either it's common ground that I was talking about Alice, or it's not common ground that I was talking about Alice. Those are the two possibilities. Both are compatible with the common ground. And both are compatible with what I know, they're also compatible with the common ground. Now we know that if it was common ground that I was talking about Alice, then I asserted the proposition Alice is a fool. Because we know by default when it is common ground what the sentence expresses, then you assert the proposition it expresses. But in the other case, where it's not common ground, what my sentence expresses, in that case, I would be asserting the diagonal. And in this case, the diagonal amounts to the proposition that either Alice or Bob is a fool. So in the other situation, where it's not common ground, what my sentence expresses, in that situation, I'm expressing the proposition either Alice is a fool or Bob is a fool. So we know that either it's common ground I was talking about Alice or it's not. If it is, we know that if it's common ground I was talking about Alice, then I asserted Alice as a fool. We know that if it wasn't common ground that Alice is a fool, then I asserted that either Alice is a fool or Bob is a fool. But now we can see that, doesn't that mean that we don't know what proposition to update with? Because depending on what the common ground is like, either I asserted that Alice is a fool, or I asserted that either Alice is a fool or Bob is a fool. But those are very different propositions. And if I don't know what the common ground is, and if it's not common ground what the common ground is, as is in fact the case, how would we know which one to actually add to the common ground? So this is exactly the kind of problem that diagonalization was introduced to solve. We saw that there are cases, simple cases, when you don't know what your sentence expresses. If all you could do was add the proposition expressed to the common ground, you wouldn't know how to update the common ground. What we've now just seen is that when you combine this ignorance about what is said with ignorance about what the common ground is, you get the same kind of problem all over again. It'll be common ground that either you're asserting the usual proposition expressed or you're asserting the diagonal, but it won't be common ground which one you're asserting. And if it's not common ground which one you're asserting, then how will you know which proposition to add to the common ground? So there's lots more to say about this, but because today's lecture has gone on quite long, I'm going to leave things there for now. But let's take stock in what we have in fact seen. So I first showed you that when these principles like KK and PP fail, then it may not be common ground what the common ground actually is. The common ground will not itself settle its own contents. It will leave open different possibilities for what its own contents might be. That itself is sort of a weird possibility, but it's something we can just see is inevitable if we deny these principles. The other thing we saw is that this possibility of the common ground not settling its own contents interacts very badly with diagonalization and the motivations for diagonalization. Because we saw that the point of introducing diagonalization was to sort of allow us to always know what proposition to add to the common ground. But when the common ground doesn't itself know what's in the common ground, then it doesn't look like diagonalization actually solves this kind of problem. Because depending on what actually is in the common ground, you will be asserting different kinds of propositions. And if you don't know what the common ground is, you won't be able to figure out what that proposition is. And this dilemma arises with the diagonal too. In some worlds in the common ground, you're going to be asserting the normal proposition expressed by a sentence. In other worlds, you're going to be asserting the diagonal. But adding the diagonal into the mix here doesn't help us solve this problem about what to add to the common ground.